Ooh boy, what has Chef Benton cooked up for y'all today? Hot damn, it's everyone's favorite three-course meal. Social justice warrior identity politics, a violent sport, and math. Yay! Hey y'all, welcome back. There's a topic near and dear to my heart that I want to talk about today. Football. No, silly, not that football. I mean the violent one. Jokes aside, I love American football to the ends of the earth, but I'll be one of the first to admit the game needs to change. One problem that gets a lot of attention but never gets fixed is the league's coaching diversity. In a sport made up of about 75% people of color, there are a whopping 4 head coaches of color in the whole league. When broadcasters talked about the subject this past January, a question struck me. How deep does this problem go? So I took it upon myself to find an answer. How? By documenting the ethnicity of NFL coaches to see if there's any possible trends. In this video, I'll be outlining the root of the diversity problem, I'll be detailing some peculiar findings from my research, and I'll be touching on possible ways to address these issues. My findings are available in a Google Doc linked below, which you can check out at any time if you'd like. Without further ado, let's go. Part 1. Pre-game. There are a few baseline points I need to address before we dig fully into the raw, sexy data. First, the NFL's history with minority coaches. Prior to 1979, there was only one head coach of color ever. And from 1979 to 2003, there were only 6 head coaches of color, causing ex-players and media members to demand change. The rule created in the wake of this outcry, the Rooney Rule, required teams to interview one minority candidate for head coaching vacancies. The goal was to give minority coaches a foot in the door, so whatever underlying biases had kept them from those positions before had less of a stranglehold. By 2006, there were 7 head coaches of color in the league, which is more in one season than the rest of NFL history. But over the last 14 years, the positive effects of the rule have slowly dwindled, as we are back to just 4 head coaches of color. Perhaps the most damning stat of all, 11 of the league's 32 teams haven't hired a head coach of color in the modern era. Next, it's important to note the ethnic makeup of football players. College football hovers around 55% players of color, and the NFL is about 75% people of color. So this issue of diversity in the workforce differs from something like women in STEM fields. The issue in that case being a lack of women encouraged or empowered to join those fields. But players of color have been the majority of players in the NFL for decades. I've seen a couple articles saying things like, the NFL has 22% black coaches, which surpasses their 13% share of the US population. But the national population isn't our baseline here. Random folks off the street don't know what it takes to be an NFL coach, so we can't act like 22.5% representation is a win, because given the player base of the NFL, that number should be higher. So when I critique the diversity in NFL coaching hires, know that I'm comparing it to the ethnic makeup of the league, not our nation's population. So if people of color populate the leagues that lead to coaching hires, why don't they have more coaching positions? Scott Brooks of Global Sports Institute argues white coaches retain most positions because of racialized organization structures, meaning the dominantly white senior citizens that make up ownership in the league have internal biases that assume white people are the best leaders for coaching jobs by default. And I want to make clear that these probable structures don't just clash with the ideal of equal representation, they interfere with the meritocracy of the NFL as well. So before any of y'all hop into the comment section to misquote Dr. King with all that "you're the real racist" BS, understand that I'm only discussing the ethnicity of these coaches because the supposed racialized organization structures seem to amplify underqualified white coaches, while dismissing qualified coaches of color. To explain some of these underqualified examples in detail, I'll give a quick bounce pass to the First Take crew.
I applaud the job that Matt LaFleur has done in Green Bay, but he was the offensive coordinator of the 27th ranked offense in the National Football League when he got the job. There is a guy in Arizona by the name of Cliff Kingsbury. He was under 500 in college football and got a head coaching job.
Want to pop in to add a bit of extra context here? Not only was Cliff Kingsbury's hire a hilarious moment of failing upward, but his predecessor was given such an unfair shake. Steve Wilkes was only given 1 season with a rookie quarterback before he was fired. which is incredibly short for NFL tenures. He was also, coincidentally, black. Given that both of these egregious actions came from the same organization, it makes this the easiest example to gesture to when talking about how organizations are super patient and willing to reach for white coaches, but often impatient with coaches of color. Anyway, back to Stephen A.
Today, we are talking about a wide receivers coach who has never even been a coordinator, and he's now going to be the head coach for a New York Giants franchise.
You're not saying anything against Joe Judge or
Not at all.
Or any guy.
all.
Some guys may surprise you. Oh, look, that turned out he was a great hire.
Yeah.
But the point is, the African-American candidate will never have a chance to surprise you because he'll never be plucked from the ranks of,
Not from a wide receiver coach.
and given the chance.
So again, just want to hammer home in this section that the failure of diversity here is not merely on a representation bias. It's also a fundamental failure of the supposed meritocracy. Whatever the reasons may be, there are biases present that keep quality coaches of color from climbing the ladder. So when I use phrases like internal biases, know that I'm referring to these implicit assumptions organizations seem to make. Otherwise, the data would reliably look different. With those terms defined, let's move on to how I collected data. Part 2. Film study. In order for me to get a good sense of what the coaching landscape was like, I couldn't just look at head coaches or coordinators. I had to log the ethnicity of every coach on every NFL roster. Also, and I say this last point assuring you I've taken steps to be as accurate as possible, sometimes there isn't enough information out there for me to know a coach's full story. Somebody like Hines Ward, a wide receiver assistant for the New York Jets, is a Hall of Fame player on top of an outspoken voice for people of his specific background, being a half Korean, half African American. But most assistant coaches aren't Hall of Famers with a well-known background. So a couple of times I'd come across a coach, but had to use alternative methods to figure out their ethnicity, such as looking up where a person's last name was most common and list that nation as their ethnicity. And that might not fully represent their life story, but it's the best I can do outside of surveying each coaching staff. This only popped up a couple of times, so it doesn't represent any massive hole in the data. I just wanted to be upfront about it. With those points of order out of the way, let's get to what everyone has been the most excited about. Hot, sexy data. Part 3. Highlight reel. I'm gonna give it to you straight, folks. It's not looking good. On the whole, the league's coaches are only 32% people of color. Of the 32 teams, 17 have coaching staffs populated by less than 30% minority coaches, and 2 coaching staffs have less than 20% minority coaches. Also, 0 staffs are dominantly minority coaches.
That's gonna be a fucking yikes for me, holy shit.
I don't even know if I have to explain more past this point. I could just cut from right here to my solutions and it would be equally justified because those numbers are kinda sad. But I'm not about to give y'all blue balls like that. Other areas of note, while head coaches are whitewashed, assistant head coaches fare better. About half the assistant head coaches are people of color or women. Defensive coordinators are 34% people of color, which I guess is nice given the low bar the NFL's already set. But that bar gets even lower when you look at special teams and offensive coordinators. Only 22% of special teams coordinators are people of color, and only 6% of offensive coordinators are people of color. That's right, only 2 people of color are OCs, which is so bad it makes the head coaching pool look like a college pamphlet photo. Those coaches make up what I'll call the Fab Five, or the 5 most important coaches on any staff. 3 coordinate main phases of the game, and the other 2 oversee the whole team. If we pool results together, we can see that the NFL has barely 17% people of color in the 5 most important coaching slots. On top of that, a whopping 14 teams don't even have a single minority coach in any of these positions. So those are the numbers for the higher-ups, but position coaches are also important to look at. With position coaches, we start to see some of the more polarized fields. For example, we finally see fields that are led by minority groups, such as running back and defensive line coaches. But we also see groups like offensive line and quarterback coaches having only 2 and 1 person of color respectively. Some of these numbers line up with the demographics of its players. Most running backs and defensive linemen are people of color, which we see reflected in their coaches. But linebackers and offensive linemen are a diverse group in the NFL, despite having only 17% and 7% coaches of color in those fields. And if we combine all these previous position coaches, as well as general offensive and defensive assistants, we find that only 23% of offensive assistants are minority coaches, 34% of special team assistants are people of color, and 44% of defensive coaches are of a minority background. And finally, a much smaller sample size, but we also see that a mere 18% of coaching assistants are people of color. Let's take a moment to finish up with some positive shout-outs. The only two teams in the league to employ coaching assistants of color, which is a sad sentence on its own, both employ 2 coaching assistants of color. The Minnesota Vikings and San Francisco 49ers have the most unique ethnicities represented, with respectively 5 or 6 non-white or non-male coaches on their staff. The Bucks, 49ers, and Eagles have women in coaching staff positions, which might not sound like a lot, but 3 teams is pretty big considering where we were a few years ago. And though they have a white head coach, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have every other major coaching position filled by an African American. I wish the shoutouts could progress past here, but that's about all I've got. So that's a quick summary of the data I've charted. Again, you can check out my more detailed findings on the document linked down in the dibbly-doo. Now that we have an understanding of how terrible the NFL's coaching landscape is, let's move on to a discussion of how to fix the problem. Part 4. Mid-game adjustments. To the NFL's credit, they're at least aware of the issue. They've tried their hand at a solution with the Rooney Rule, but it seems the rule can only go so far. To quote Scott Brooks again, "We can legislate behavior, we can make people have to do certain things, but we cannot, in fact, change mindsets." While definitely a hurdle, the difficulty to enact change isn't an excuse to maintain the status quo either. So we need to do something. And I am far from the first to acknowledge this issue. Analysts across networks and folks across the league have expressed frustration with the current system.
So it's going to be this way until things change, and no matter how much people say about it, no matter how much people say, oh, Rooney Rule, you got to interview these guys, the coaches will still look a certain way for the most part.
And by the way, how Steve Wilkes got fired in a year, I have no idea. That's as unfair as anything that's happened in years in this league. You got to at least give him a second try,
at
right?
Least.
Just one more.
To let the quarterback grow in the system for you.
Black men are not being treated fairly in the National Football League. Somebody got to say it. We got to change this Rooney Rule. It's bogus. What it was intended to produce is being circumvented. And black men in the National Football League are being ostracized from key positions.
At the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much you talk about it. Because it's not changing. The people who could change it make billions and billions of dollars, and they can care less.
And out of this valid frustration have come a bunch of different solutions. Some argue that the Rooney Rule needs to be expanded to require teams to interview outside their organization, and others argue that teams should have 2 coaching assistant or quality control positions set aside for minority candidates. Needless to say, there's a wide breadth of solutions available. The NFL, as of May, expanded the Rooney Rule to require 2 minority candidate interviews for head coach openings, as well as require 1 minority interview for all coordinator openings. And those solutions start us in the right direction, but given how deep the problem goes when you look at the data I've collected, it seems they might need even more changes. I'll start this discussion of solutions using a clip of Super Bowl winning coach Tony Dungy.
And now we don't like defensive coaches. We're all enamored with offense and quarterback coaches and scoring. It's like we forgot that Bill Belichick was a defensive coach. He's pretty good. Pete Carroll was a defensive coach. He's won some Super Bowls. Mike Tomlin has won some Super Bowls. But no, we want the scoring machine and the young guns.
As he starts to outline there, coaches of color used to cut their teeth and establish their name on the defensive side of the ball. Almost every minority coach in NFL history has a background as a defensive coordinator. No matter the reason, this pipeline eventually became obsolete. As rule changes allowed offenses to flourish, more and more coaches started to get hired with a background in offense. This season, ex-offensive minds represent about 60% of all head coaches. As the league has slowly cared less and less about defense, minority coaches who spent decades in defensive coaching rooms now find themselves struggling for head coaching jobs. As I said before, there are only 2 offensive coordinators of color and only 1 quarterback coach of color. Offensive assistant staffs are only 23% minority coaches. only 8% of new hire offensive coordinators were coaches of color between 2009 and 2018. So regardless of intent, the coaching positions that most often lead to head coaching jobs aren't open to the types of people that populate the league. You see this inability to put people of color in the same mind space of offensive geniuses when discussing the next crop of coaches. It's always the next Sean McVay and not the next Eric Bieniemy. It shows us how ready we are to categorize this McVay type of person as an offensive genius, and how much we struggle to see somebody like Bieniemy in that role. And I wonder how much the entrenched stereotypes about quarterbacks of color have impacted these demographics. It wasn't until my lifetime, if not more specifically my adulthood, that quarterbacks of color stopped having their talent questioned. Well, actually, we're still not really out of that mindset. As recently as 2018, top QB prospect Lamar Jackson got the same treatment many a black quarterback have known for years. His physical attributes were complimented, but people questioned his intangible skills like leadership and, intelligence. It was thrown around a lot that he was more of an athlete than a quarterback, which is a loaded term in of itself, and some teams wanted him to try out as a wide receiver. This is a pattern that a Washington Post study found to be consistent with black quarterbacks, and it's a pre-draft treatment that white quarterbacks aren't as often subjected to. And if executives in the league struggle to see black guys as viable quarterbacks, it cannot be overstated the impact that can have on an executive's perception of whether or not a black guy can coach the same positions. Because if we look at the data, we'll see that 50% of offensive coordinators were primarily QB coaches early in their career, and another 35% had hefty experience with quarterbacks, meaning that 85% of offensive coordinators were trusted to coach quarterbacks at some point. And if people of color were so rarely trusted to be quarterbacks in the NFL for decades, it stands to reason that they wouldn't have too many opportunities to coach quarterbacks either. Now, why does a quarterback and his coach matter so much? Well, quarterbacks and their coaches need to read defenses and change blocking schemes and adjust routes on the fly, which requires a huge amount of knowledge to run an offense smoothly. So with the most influential position on the offensive side of the ball withheld from people who weren't white up until, let's be clear, very recently, some institutional change is needed to open up these opportunities to people of color. Which, finally, brings me to some proposals. If we want to stay away from hiring quotas, perhaps the NFL should expand the Rooney Rule to every coaching position, a change which would require NFL front offices to dig deep and bring in new voices, be it from college or other professional leagues. Now, obviously, relying on an interview and not a hiring quota might have the same pitfalls as the current Rooney Rule. Again, no one's bound to any systemic change. But unlike the current Rooney Rule, I think the number of interviews required changes the equation a bit. It's easy for teams to get lazy and bring out, as they did this past year, one of the 2 or 3 noteworthy and unemployed head coaches of color to check the box off of the current Rooney Rule. But there isn't a recognizable group of position coaches league-wide, so teams would be forced to scout for candidates. And if not every position, at least expand the Rooney Rule to every offensive position, so we can start to erode the coaching disparities on the offensive side of the ball. But again, the amendment can only go so far. Another option then is to have quotas. This option takes the firmest step towards making change happen, by getting numerous people into the coaching pipeline. I worry though that teams would just create some bullshit assistant roles to put people of color in to meet the quotas.
In effect, what this new proposal does, it is telling people like myself who have interviewed for high-ranking positions, it's not just about your competency. It's really about whether or not there's something else that would make us move on this kind of situation. And quite honestly, that is something that's insulting.
So I'm not sure if this is the answer either. And aside from any league-wide policy, I wonder what might happen if the NFL Players Association and members of the press start calling out specific organizations. I first got this idea from listening to The Odd Couple on Fox Sports 1, not the Neil Simon play.
How about if the union puts out a list?
Right, a historical list. So now you know
now
it's
I'm
not
like,
just at this point in time.
To give me a gauge to say they've only had one African American in their front office in the last 30 years, or some sort of number to give you, and then you say the Carolina Panthers have had 15 African American, including a Hispanic coach, and then you give them a grade. That's what it comes down to.
What we're asking the athletes to do is use the power that you have, which is your athletic ability, your fame, your wealth, your connections to corporations in America. You have all that. And that's leverage. Michael Jordan.
There is leverage, and you got to know how to use it.
My data only covers this upcoming season, for I am but a single lowly piley, but the Players Association, what with its multi-million-dollar operating budget, could easily compile like a 20-year study on each franchise. If a team has a long-standing history of only empowering or supporting white coaches, that fact could be made public in specific numbers. Hell, I even found some other organizations committed to similar studies. So maybe all the NFLPA has to do is just signal boost those results. Players and coaches are obviously free to do with that information as they will, but it might make franchises panic into having more diverse coaching staffs. And before any naysayers hop into the comment section and say this is some new agey woke segregation, it's not. It has directly to do with valid career decisions players make. A number of players can find post-career opportunities with the franchises they played for. So if a press release from the NFLPA demonstrates that the team who drafted you gives a cold shoulder to folks who look like you after they're done exploiting your athletic skills, it's in your best interest to invest playing time with a team that does empower folks like you post-career. And given how stubborn some NFL owners are, the most effective way to make franchises change might be public pressure. For example, the Jaguars' former president of football operations, Tom Coughlin, had a history of issuing flippant fines. The Jaguars were largely supportive of Coughlin. But the absolute second the NFLPA released a statement dissuading players from joining the Jaguars because of these unnecessary fines they should expect, the Jaguars fired Coughlin. The last thing leadership wants is a press release or a tweet telling NFL players and coaches to steer clear of their franchise. So maybe concentrated public pressure is the answer. Again, I am not an expert here, so I'm not entirely sure which of these solutions might be the best, but these are a few of the stronger solutions I've seen. Part 5. Conclusion. There's a glaring problem in the NFL. Due to its history with segregation and various racial biases, its leadership in coaching positions fails to match the makeup of the league. And in some very specific ways too, with certain position coaches being almost entirely staffed by white people. Despite other coaching positions being dominantly people of color, those positions don't lead to head coaching gigs as easily, making the coaching landscape whitewashed. As I outlined earlier, there are many possible solutions to the problem, and I'm absolutely curious to see what anyone watching this has to say, in the form of comments left down below. But what is undeniable is the problem at hand. It's not fair to just assume that because civil rights happened 55 years ago, that we're a perfect meritocracy now. We're still recovering from our biases as a nation, and the NFL has some very specific manifestations of its racial biases. But I'm glad to see the NFL's committed to change, and I hope they can find the right solution. Anyway, thanks for watching, everybody. I hope this video appealed to the non-sporty types in my audience. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to toss me one of them likes and subscribe down below, making sure to click the little bell so you can know the exact nanosecond I release my next video. Thanks y'all, and I'll see you next time.